It's often mentioned that there are only two OECD countries that don't give paid maternity leave. It's Australia and the United States, which, is the biggest. So it's pretty tough there. And you think, well, why? The women have been so great at pushing for things. And I suspect it's part of the reason is that what you are looking at quite closely in this is the confluence of the second wave of feminism coming in with neoliberal policies and the free market, globalisation, that these two came in around the same time and have had quite a huge impact in family policy.
Yes. Yes, one of the things I was arguing in the essay was that there is what I call a get-to-work ideology, and we've overturned, thankfully, the old compulsory homemaker, Stepford wife ideal, and we are now attempting, as societies across the West, to move to places where women have greater opportunity. But at the same time, there were two things which really came after the 60s, and one was the women's movement, which quite understandably, as a necessary corrective to the old homemaker identity, asserted the value and importance of paid work. And unsurprisingly, they had unequal wages. They were told to resign from the public service when they were married. There were all kinds of really enforced ways of living through legislation and discrimination and so on. But at the same time, as the feminist movement proposed, paid work as a really important new ideal, it also happened that we had the neoliberal free market revolution, the great movement with Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan and so on, but through the whole political lives of nations where the value of paid work there really has come through as an ideal. To give you some idea, or concrete idea of, in the US now, there's sort of the rights of mothers, for example, even to have any sort of support if they were on their own and could not share the caregiving and paid work with a partner or a husband, so that if they were on a pension or the equivalent of a pension, a welfare, those women are now forced in some states to go back as early as 3 months. There's a lot of stigma attached to not working. There is medical benefits tied to full-time work, so that if you're partnered by a self-employed man, then you will want to work full-time in order to protect your family's medical benefits. It took 11 years of intense political struggle just to get 3 months of unpaid parental and caregiver family leave. So you're looking at a society which gives very little possibility of doing much care which is protected or supported. When you go back to work, however, it really isn't so great either, because you're using childcare which is largely provided for profit chains, which is poor quality. To give you an idea here, one of the most prestigious investigations into childcare found that less than 10% of childcare in America was of good quality. So you can see that families, but women in particular, mothers, are presented here with a completely impossible set of choices.
And we can also see too, Anne, that the maternal and child poverty rates in the United States are the worst in the OECD.
Yes, which is shocking when you think that this is one of the richest or the richest society in the world. And there can't be any excuses for that. If you move even a little further afield and look at women who've been caregivers all their life, I don't mean necessarily just homemakers, but been working as well, they are in old age far more likely to be in poverty than elsewhere. So if you look at the examples I'm talking about in Northern Europe, in Finland and Sweden, Norway and so on, there child poverty is the least and maternal poverty is the least, and they seem to me to be really important achievements. I mean, one of the interesting things about the work that is now done on the question of mothering and work is that it's not actually being female so much that is associated with poverty, but actually being a mother, which is an extraordinary thing when I'm talking about in the US, that it is making those decisions on behalf of others and being involved in their care that is most likely to see you slip below the poverty line, rather than simply being female. Because if you are able to have other people caring for your children, or if you're childless, then and you have a very good career, then you can, of course, have a good position in the labour market.
You have made the point that it's just so incongruous that at the same time we've got this free market approach to the economy, we've also had someone who wanted, in the form of John Howard, who wanted conservative family values, and they just don't go together.
No, they don't. I've rarely seen in social policy a more imperfect match. But it's true. He both supported the single income family, and he certainly, with rhetoric, supported stay-at-home mothers, none of which I have an objection to, so long as it is part of an overall package of policies which also supports people who are doing it differently, those who are part-time, those who are full-time, childcare and so on. So to actually support at-home parents is not something that we should not do as a society. But at the same time, he wanted to support those people. He didn't want to bring in paid maternity leave or do anything about improving the quality of childcare. So it was this narrow focus, I think. And at a time when, if you look at the economy, you only have to look at the housing affordability crisis to see how impossible his desires were to marry this push to the free market, for Australia to go to all sorts of ways of deregulating the labour market with his work choices and the measures taken before that.
It's probably the biggest blind spot, isn't it, this idea that working families have never had it so good. It's probably really one of the things that they fundamentally got wrong, the Liberals.
Yes. I think, yes, that's a really interesting question, because we have to ask ourselves why so many people do respond to the rhetoric which is now surrounding working families and working parents and so on. We almost never hear politicians speaking without talking about the working people. And at some level, some of these people are really very prosperous, it's true. If you look at Clive Hamilton's work on what he calls affluenza, I mean, I see evidence for it all the time. I drive through suburbs where there are 4-bedroom houses with multiple bathrooms and 4-wheel drives, and I walk into Harvey Norman with a $5,000 plasma TV and a $5,000 barbecue on the other side. So here is a high consumption society, and that, the interesting thing about that is that the neoliberal world of John Howard is very much promoting a high consumption society. But then we have to say, why do people respond to this sense of working and so on? And I think it's twofold. The first is that it's actually really difficult to pay for all those things. And the way you pay for the kind of affluent lifestyle is to enter a work and spend cycle. And you send 2 parents into the workforce, to cut a long story short. And so it is there's a kind of psychological hardship where parents feel incredibly under pressure all the time to be moving between the care domain for children and work. Now, I'd add to that, affluenza doesn't cover the entirety of the Australian population, and you actually do have people who are now being outbid for housing by those who are more affluent, who have faced very high rents, who are doing it incredibly toughly, and where the whole society depends on things like mobile phones and computers, and all of which are extremely expensive. So it becomes quite hard to actually step away from that, and it's what some research in America called the 2-income trap, that you begin to have everything, not just where you're making a choice to have a 2-income life and to have 2 people in the workforce, but you actually are forced to do it. And then, you're not looking at autonomy and freedom and liberty at all. You're looking at something very different.
You're looking at a market all the time. Tony Blair's experience as the British Prime Minister, things changed there quite a lot during his tenure in terms of the approach to what is the best, in terms of who's looking after children and how it's done. Can you outline how that changed? Because he really started off with I shouldn't, use that work will set you free in a way, the awful Nazi sign that work will set you free. But in a sense, women have had the work will set you free thing pushed at them now for a number of decades.
Oh, yes.
And it doesn't necessarily come true.
No. Yes, that's what I'm really trying to grapple with here. But I think we've been rather slow to pick this up because we've been looking backward, if you like, at the great threat to women is them being forced to go home or forced to be Stepford wives. But in fact, if you look at the Blair government, if you look at the, even though they were talking in quite conservative ways about women under the Bush administration, nonetheless, the push has been to get women to go to work. It is partly governed by falling fertility, because if fertility falls, you have fewer and fewer of the younger generation coming into the workforce of working age, who then support with their taxes the older people, especially the huge cohort of baby boomers, and of course all the other care and dependent needs we have. So that this economic imperative coming from falling fertility across the world has governments and policymakers of all stripes really pushing for women to go into work. And I think too the neoliberal ideology does have, if you look at their attitude to welfare and all sorts of areas, it does have an ideology that work is virtuous. I call it an enchanted value in the essay, and it has been. I think there's been a kind of eros around it as, that it will bring all the good things in life, when in fact most of our lives it's one element of life and it's an important element, but it's more complex.
It's also very class-based in a way, in that very few people now would think it bourgeois to expect to enjoy your work, but the fact is that a lot of people don't enjoy their work. They do it because they have to do it. Some people have really shitty jobs.
Yes.
And it's not the same as getting back to the job that you love and you love getting up for every day and sort of juggling everything to make that fit. A lot of it's just damned onerous, isn't it?
Yes. That's a very strange thing. We now seem to have forgotten that most people, past and present, work in order to live. They don't live in order to work. And it's really a very small minority of the elite who just live and breathe their work and have their mobile phone attached to them all through the night and day, and care about work in the ways that we're used to seeing.
This causes a lot of heat, doesn't it? Particularly in women's circles, feminist circles, the so-called mother wars about what is going on here. But I'm often astonished at how angry women can get when other women say, look, I think this is a good idea, this is what I find, this is what I find. Because it did, for a number of reasons, the mainstream feminist move was really that you needed to get back to work as quickly as possible. I can understand a lot of it. I think jeopardising your career can be extremely risky for women who might find themselves dumped in middle age, and they might have raised their children and they've got no way of getting back in the workforce or having the rest of their lives supported properly.
Yes. No, well, I don't think that the centrality of work came from nowhere, nor do I think it's without value. None of the things I'm proposing actually marginalise women from the workforce or say, well, let's start supporting a homemaker ideal. And it is actually trying to get a more seamless integration between periods of life that are involved with care and out again, and also allow men to do that kind of care. I think, though, we do have to get a balance on the way we see work. And I think the way I put it is, I think we've just over-egged the pudding on it. We speak about it as if this is the essence of everything. And in fact, if you look at those who are fed up with the whole affluenza way of life, they're often cutting back You know, and I don't notice many people saying, oh, it's terrible when people downshift, you know, if they cut back and spend more hours on the, you know, fishing or something other. So that I think there is a kind of nervousness about the question, which is understandable from a historical point of view, but is not seeing this much greater push at the moment for us to get to our workstations. I'll give you a couple of examples. In Britain, you were talking about the Blair government. Early on, they commissioned a report called Listening to Women. And when the report came in, it was hugely various, hugely diverse, which actually does represent what women are actually like. You know, there were some who wanted to stay at home, there were some who wanted to go straight back to work very early, some who thought a middle path was desirable. There was people who valued work, there were people who wanted full-time mothering support, you know, so here was a whole you know, panorama of different voices. Instead, there was, when the report was published, there were photos of women, you know, virtuously at their workstations, and it was all about childcare and you know, getting women back into work. In fact, none of the listening had really translated into you know, actively taking on board what this huge, diverse range of modern women were actually saying. Another example would be, I just read a report from a New Zealand postgraduate who's done a thesis comparing the advice coming out of the you know, women's affairs type of unit with first-time mothers in their mothers groups. And there's a complete disconnect with the things that the mothers are valuing and thinking about and what the policymakers are saying. So, you know, I think that when we think about the mother wars and these types of concepts, I think that it is more to do with elite groups slugging it out in the media. I think that while it is true everyone could get twitchy about choices which cast, even if they're not, even inadvertently, a negative light on another, nonetheless, you know, I find most parents and mothers pretty open to what other people are doing and pretty supportive of what the others are doing. If you're moving outside the media and those kinds of circles.
Oh, they love a stoush, don't they?
Well, they do. Yes.
Well, that's true. And, you know, there are enough people who are prepared to give it to them too. Yes. There are. Yeah, well, remember that famous Michael Looney cartoon of the tiny little baby in childcare. And he was saying, look, I was really saying, look, these for-profit childcare centres are cruel and terrible. They're making women think they're useless, brain-dead people if they stay at home with a baby. They're out there creating a market. They're making money out of it. But it didn't really help that he had the little baby lying there saying, well, yes, you might say my mother is a stupid, selfish bitch, but I still think the world of her. You know, he was pretty cheeky. You can see why women felt the old dagger going in. I think no matter what choices you make, it's the nature of being a mother that you're going to feel guilty. And so that's what people can play on here. You know, anyone can feel vulnerable. You found in one of the studies you looked at, there was a woman who was looking at doing some research on childcare and the effects on children, good, bad. Yes. And she said, admitted, I actively wanted to find that childcare was good for children. We're talking children here, 2-3-year-olds and under. But that's what she wanted to find. I thought, what an amazing admission for someone who's doing some research to make, saying what I want to find.
Yes, but it was also an honest admission. And actually it's better if people are honest about that, I think, and say, look, this is the way I lived, and that's obviously going to shape the way I think about it. And I think that it would be better if we heard more of that from people of you know, of all kinds of ways of doing things when they had children, so that you actually do, you know, have some sense of where they're coming from. I think it is true that it's childcare in particular is a very hard issue to raise. Many people don't want to raise it because they fear arousing the anger which comes from guilt. I think that is a humanly understandable position.
Well, you've seen it before. I have read Prue Goward and other people's responses to your book on motherhood, and Prue wrote something I was quite surprised at, saying, oh, Ant-Man has this wonderful pastoral view of babies crawling over their mother's lap and all this. I thought, well, that sounds quite nice, actually. Mothers, babies, it's not that a dreadful idea. But she was pretty cross about it, and that's the sort of reaction we get. So it's very hard for a woman, if you're educated, if you're still interested in a career or anything, to sort of say, to really come out and just say, I think my baby would be better off with me for the first 3 years.
Yes.
How do we make that work?
Well, just I'll speak a little bit about Prue Goward, because I think she is representative. She did a superb job arguing for paid parental leave.
Yeah.
And I'd always admire her for that. However, she, in doing that, she tried to argue really that this was a universal path. In my essay, I have some quotes from her where she says things like, the only thing stopping women going back to work is the absence of childcare, and the only people who are at home are those driving Volvos or basically unemployed people. So it was, the idle rich or people who are the implication was some
beyond hope.
Beyond hope, yes. Mm. Now, if you look at the actual figures, and she knows the figures because she quoted them in her reports, that is not an accurate picture of Australian family life. Most people do not go back to work in the first year. There's something like in 2005 there was 7% were using childcare, and that includes using informal care as well as formal care. Even fewer than that were in childcare centres. If you look at parental behaviour as children get older, they gradually use a little more childcare. By the time they're 3 and 4, they're using kindergarten programs and so on. So, that's the reality of the way Australian parents live. If you look at the ACTU, when they brought out their test case looking at parental leave, longer paid parental leave, they really worked from their members' preferences and their members' desires. So working women were hoping for more time with small children. So I don't know whether Prue actually read the book carefully, because actually it was, in terms of childcare, it was a nuanced and careful and very well researched argument about childcare, and it was using the research on childcare to show why we need these longer periods of paid parental leave. So I think Prue is an example of the particular ideological tribe who are well-meaning, have the best interests of women at heart. It's just that they are universalising from their own experience. There is no universal when it comes to this period or when you come to women's lives. The really substantive empirical work shows that after the equal opportunities revolution, after the feminist revolution, there is not one path but many. And most Australian parents neither fit the Stepford wife model of conservative dreams, nor do they fit the get to work, baby in the briefcase model of those like Prue Goward.
Those women, as you say, very well-meaning, but they've also been backed up and supported by a certain skewing of the research, haven't they?
Yes.
Of a wrong emphasis put on the research. One of the studies you look at is for the preschool program that was actually for very socially disadvantaged kids who benefited from high quality childcare. Now that study has been extrapolated and applied to all different situations everywhere, where people will say, oh, childcare is great, it's good for the kids, it's beneficial, but it's being applied to the totally different situation.
Yes, yes. No, this is one of the most remarkable, even I might say one of the greatest social policy hoaxes of all time. That is, we are extrapolating from especially one particular small-scale study from the 1960s of very disadvantaged African American families. Children were really very delayed in their development. The families were in trouble. There were many sole parents in the group, and it was part of the ghetto. It was a particular period of American history. So it had this intervention program, which was wonderful, was imaginative, which was beautifully thought out, was superbly staffed with people with postgraduate degrees. It was very careful with home visiting as well, so that you actually improved the parents' own skills. In every way, this was a marvellous project, and we should think about projects like that in order to assist all kinds of people in our community who might equally be needing of help. However, the problem comes when you say, oh, well, that's the same as a child going from loving parents who, may have their doubts about this and that, but are basically doing a very good job, and going into the kind of centre that you were talking about that your daughter worked in, or into a centre where they have, 2 caregivers to 10 babies, and they're struggling.
Oh, it must be
with that.
Just such a lousy job, I think, for so many of those care workers to try and cope with it all.
But we mustn't extrapolate from that small-scale study or any of the other, very fine work with disadvantaged children. You have to look at, too, what childcare is like in the here and the now, and what ordinary childcare is like for ordinary parents.
Now, while that study is being used to generalise about the provision of childcare in so many countries, saying that it's a good, that it helps children, other studies which are shown that there can be deleterious effects on children if they are in childcare at a young age, we're talking about even 2, 3-year-old, for extended periods of time, it can actually have a deleterious effect in terms of the elevated cortisol levels in the body, which measure stress. And these studies are credible, aren't they?
Yes. There are really 2 bodies of work which have come out from the 1980s on, but I'd argue by the 21st century we're now very clear on a couple of things, and it is true that there is a higher risk for children showing up more aggression and emotional difficulties, not universally in childcare, so we shouldn't catastrophise and exaggerate the evidence, but a higher percentage of children will show up these difficulties if they are in longer hours of childcare, up from more than 10 hours, but particularly more than 30 hours when you get into really full-time childcare across the first couple of years of life, and when it's very early. So we're talking about the under 2s here. There are substantive, really sophisticated statistical studies done with more than 1,000 children in America and also now in Britain, and that has shown this link between aggression quite decisively. It doesn't affect every child, but it affects more children than those in parental care.
It was statistically significant.
Oh, absolutely. It went from, for example, for those under 10 hours, and this is in the big American study, children who were showing more aggressive behavioural problems, those went from 6% to 17%. So it was, really multiplied by 3 times.
And they also tested those children spending a day at home, and the cortisol levels went right down.
Yes. So the other body of work is to do with cortisol, and they found that children in childcare tended to have higher cortisol. It was certainly mediated, that is, it was helped by having higher quality care, and not just ratios and things like that, but more intimate and more attentive, more family style care, if you like. But it couldn't remove it altogether, and it was very clear children in childcare had, instead of the normal cortisol pattern, which is a stress hormone, goes up in the morning and then normally will go down in the afternoon. So these children's cortisol levels continue to go up. So that was very clear evidence. Now the combination of those 2 bits of evidence, which was reproduced across a number of studies, it wasn't just one study, it was a cluster, which is what you're looking for in social science, really transformed, I think, the Blair government's approach to these issues. So that after really pushing very early on for women to return very quickly to work and to use childcare and to see not just work as the answer to everything, but also childcare as the way of ending every single child development problem, they changed to adopting the Scandinavian style policies. So they've now moved to aiming by next year to have a full year of paid leave, but 2 years parental leave, where you can return to your previous job, but also the right to work part-time, because that's another element which is part of the Scandinavian policies.
Well, and I think it would be wonderful to see Kevin Rudd take up the suggestion that women and men in Australia can be offered a choice of subsidised childcare, high-quality childcare, or the choice to take the equivalent of that money and look after their own children. And I think it would be a wonderful day if we see that. And it's been great speaking with you. Thank you.
Thank you.